Hi, 7th graders, welcome back. Today we're reviewing Unit 5 content on the Civil War. Our aim is to describe the cause, the course, and the consequence of the Civil War. So let's first talk about the cause. We know that the Civil War was caused partially due to sectionalism. We know that the North and South of America became very, very different. Each section had their own economies and their own ways of life. We know that the North became very industrialized. That means they had a lot of factories, they had railroads. Their workers who worked in these factories received wages for their labor instead of like being enslaved where they didn't get paid. The North was not dependent on slavery. They had the wage labor. The South, on the other hand, was very reliant on agriculture, and because they had so much farming, they needed a lot of slave labor. So they were less industrialized and more agricultural. We know that as America begins to expand, that manifest destiny, we're scooping up land left and right. As we expand and new territories are becoming states, America has new fights over which states will be free and which states will allow enslaved people. We know that there were many compromises, like the Compromise of 1850 and the Great Compromise. However, none of these compromises ends this question of slavery. So we're having some fights between people who live in the North and people who live in the South over whether or not these new territories should come in as slave states or free states. We know that most problems between the North and the South were rooted in this question of slavery. So sometimes you talk to people who say that there were plenty of different causes for the Civil War, like states' rights and sectionalism, but all of those things have their roots in slavery. Southern states wanted states' rights so that they could choose to keep slavery. The North was not looking to expand slavery. And at the same time, the South is afraid that the North is going to just outlaw or abolish slavery entirely. And so we get to this election of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is elected. This was considered the last straw for many Southern states. Southern states really believed that Lincoln and his party would work to abolish or end slavery. And so instead of working with him as a president, these states, starting with South Carolina, began seceding from the United States. And they seceded because they were trying to preserve the institution of slavery. They thought that Lincoln would abolish it. Here we see, when we just look at how the Electoral College worked out, Southern states unanimously did not vote for Lincoln, whereas Northern states did. When it comes time to secede, all of the states that did not vote for Lincoln did not also chose to secede. So the Civil War goes on, and over time, Lincoln realizes he really doesn't like the idea of going to war, but he does think that it's very necessary. He thinks that the Union must continue to fight this war and they must win so that the United States can become unified by the end. Near the end of the war, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This frees enslaved people in rebelling states. So enslaved people are not instantly freed with this proclamation because Southern states were not listening to American laws at this time. It does eventually lead to the banning of slavery in the United States with that 13th Amendment. So that is because in the course of the war, the consequence of the Civil War was Reconstruction. This is the time period when our country is back under construction because we're bringing our country back together and we're helping formerly enslaved people be given new rights. So America is both trying to get those southern states back into the country, and America is also trying to help formerly enslaved people figure out how to live as now free people. There were some successes of Reconstruction. One is that slavery ended, and we know that it ended with the 13th Amendment. We also know that formerly enslaved people were given citizenship and rights. That was the 14th Amendment. They were also given the voting right, the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. And there were also new programs created to help Black Americans get started. And those programs were things like the Freedmen's Bureau. So there are plenty of successes, these Reconstruction amendments that are freeing enslaved people, granting citizenship and voting rights, and also programs to help establish schools and get people jobs. However, Reconstruction did not fully meet all of its goals. It had many failures. One were Jim Crow laws. These were laws that took away many of these rights. Jim Crow laws did things like segregate public facilities so that Black and white people weren't going into the same buildings or using the same resources. Groups like the KKK began to terrorize formerly enslaved people. And a new system known as sharecropping bound many people to the plantations that once enslaved them. Here's an example of how sharecropping works. It starts here where the sharecropper is allowed to borrow some land, and in return he promises to give the landowner some of his crops. The sharecropper has to buy everything on credit, so they're borrowing money from the landowner to survive. They plant and harvest. They give a portion of their land to the landowner. But when they're settling up, a lot of times the landowner would say that the sharecropper owed more than he had earned. And as a result, the sharecropper would have to stay and then try again the next year. This created a cycle of poverty where sharecroppers who had few options were trapped into working on the same land that they did as enslaved people. All right, seventh graders, you guys have a great day today.